Welcome gentlemen, gentlewomen and gentle children. Today is Saturday. We are entering the weekend, our first weekend of February, with a surprise set of hotfix buffs and nerfs going live next reset. So in about 3 days or so, we're gonna get all of these changes going live. There is actually quite a good amount of nice changes, expected changes, well-awaited type of changes, mostly buffs, a couple of nerfs overall. So let's go quickly to inspect exactly what got changed. First in line is Death Knight. When I say Death Knight, I start with Blood, because Blood gets all of the damage of these abilities, Hurt Strike, Blood Plague, Blood Boil, Death and Decay and Shattering Bone, buffed by a whole bunch. Why does this happen? Because the current damage of Death Knight looks like this. This is their damage on single target. If you try to look at AoE, the situation doesn't actually change that much for Death Knight. It's still the weakest of the specs in general when talking about tanks AoE damage. The buffs in question should be, roughly by looking at the damage they are doing right now, some 7-ish% damage increase in AoE and roughly half of that when it comes to single target for Blood Death Knight, which is it's good. Blood is already doing fine overall as a spec. What they were missing perhaps as their bigger weakness in Mythic Plus was also their lower damage compared to other tanks, and now Blizzard is moving towards making them a little bit stronger. We are not done though, we are not done when it comes to Death Knight, because we also have Frost. Frost also, like Death Knight, gets some flat damage increases. 15% to Frost Fever, 20% to Glacial Advance, 10% to Frost Strike, double the damage to Frostwell Shade, and 35% damage increase to Frost Sight. However, what has interested the Death Knights more is that Cleaving Strikes, so the AoE buff you gain inside of Death and Decay, now makes Obliterate hit 2 additional targets instead of 1. This has propped up some significant copium abuse of Frost Death Knights who start hoping about the coming of the two-handed Obliterate build. This has been a long time coming, all the way back to the 4th dynasty of Egyptian pharaohs. If you remember, Khafre was already predicting this in one of his prophecies. All the way back in this scripture, for example, right over there, you can find Khafre harbinging the coming of two-handed Obliterate Frost builds. And, it's been 4,600 years, we are still waiting for that to happen. Maybe these changes is what are going to do it for Frost Death Knight. We then have what seems like the 6th round of tuning in a row, which includes Guardian Druid. We have a series of buffs once more for Guardian, 20% more armor for Iron Fur, just flat out, and then a whole bunch of buffs to talents. Very heavily defensive talents, so Reinforced Fur giving you more armor to your Iron Fur and more damage reduction to your Barkskin. Ursoc's Fury going back to 50% of damage turned into an Absorb Shield after getting Giga nerfed, all the way back to 30% at the start of this expansion. Reinvigoration now giving you more cooldown to your Frenzied Region, Layered Main now doubling the chance of proccing a second use of Iron Fur for free, and massive healing increase to Lunar Beam. Now, what's the problem with these buffs? Is that these buffs are the Schrodinger's buffs for Guardian. Why? Because they are both alive and dead at the same time. They are alive because they are all buffs. They are dead because these are the talents currently buffed, and these are the talents that Guardian Druids currently run. So they are not buffs until Guardian Druid players actually change their build and actually start taking these talents. Until that happens, then nothing much is changing for Guardian besides the flat out 20% more armor generated by Iron Fur and what we pointed out yesterday, the bug fix, which gave them back 15% magical damage reduction from Tooth and Claw, which is a talent they always take, so that's also a buff. Possibly that bug fix was actually more important than the buffs they are receiving now in this hotfix. Then we have something very simple, very quick, not much of a need for explanation. Restoration Druid gets a nerf to 3% of all of their healing, and Preservation Evoker gets a nerf to 5% of all of their healing. Not much needs to be said. They are currently the two best specs, so now the two best specs get nerfed in their throughput. That's basically how it is. We then have yet another round of buffs to Hunters. Now, this one is a bit on the lazy side, because all 3 specs are simultaneously buffed by 5% to all of their abilities. Of course, you can be happy as a hunter, because at least you're getting buffed, but, some of these are not really too effective. Marksmanship Hunters 1 is perhaps the more meaningful one. Beast Mastery and Survival are perhaps the weaker ones, in the sense that they have other problems, rather than getting buffed in damage flat out. As you can see here, in the single target boss damage right now in the raid, Beast Mastery is already one of the strongest single target DPS specs. So their damage was already great, already very, very high when it comes to single target. Their problem is that structurally in their talent tree, they have to drop enormous amounts of single target damage if they want to do AoE. And then vice versa, they have to drop enormous amounts of AoE if they want to do proper single target. This is a problem that a few other specs have at the moment, like for example Unholy Death Knight or Elemental Shaman or partially Affliction Warlock. The way their talents work make them lose a lot of damage if they want to specialize in a certain build. Look at this one. This one is the AoE build of Unholy, and this is the single target build of Unholy. Essentially you are moving some 5 talents around from the left side, AoE, to the right side, single target. This is not the same problem of a few other specs which can continue to do, respectable AoE damage as they pump single target, or top tier AoE damage while they still have decent single target. Not to mention, of course, the other long requested set of changes to Hunters, which is their lacking of defensiveness, their survivability, their self-sustain, which they lack at the moment as well. Not to mention to finish the elephant in the room when it comes to Beast Mastery Hunter, which is the fact that their damage is this high entirely because of this. Blizzard is forced to balance Beast Mastery around a single item, which is currently mega inflating the damage they are doing, and once they lose this, they will lose a massive part of their damage. This is in fact basically a legendary. The only reason why Blizzard didn't put this as a legendary is because they didn't want the player base complain that Hunters were getting yet another special item, but by all means, this is a legendary. Here you go, I'm gonna change it for you. Magic, now it's a legendary, because that's the actual value of this bow. Now, after the green class, we go to a slightly lighter shade of green, because it's Mistweaver. So, Mistweaver gets buffed once again. All healing is increased by 3%, Vivify is increased by 5%, 2 very big buffs to Clouded Focus and Peaceful Mending, and then even better damage buff to Spinning Crane Kick, and then even better buffs to Ancient Concordance and Lesson of Doubt. Now, what is the problem with these buffs is that while roughly half of these are good, the biggest ones, Clouded Focus and Peaceful Mending, in case you don't play Mistweaver, they are bad because these are buffs to the hard casting style of Mistweaver. So not fist weaving, okay, not going melee, use a bunch of damage abilities to heal, no, just the hard casting style, which is shit and nobody plays it. And of course, none of these 2 talents is actually played by Mistweaver. Of course, the logic of Blizzard is that's why we are buffing them, because nobody is playing with them. The problem is that, you would have to change the entire build as a Mistweaver to start playing the hard-casted version, kind of like the whole debate between the melee Paladin build and the hard-casted build, which we were lamenting before the expansion released. Please, Blizzard, stop trying to make the hard-casted Paladin happen. It's not going to happen. Blizzard continued to spend points in their talent tree for useless abilities and useless passives which would not have been used by Holy Paladin, and what happened is that Holy Paladin went live with a talent tree where a third of their talents are dead because the build doesn't work. So Mistweaver is perhaps in not as bad of a situation when it comes to their talent tree, but still, buffing just these couple of talents for that different type of build is not really going to change too much for Mistweaver in how they will play. We then have some good buffs on a similar note to the ones to Blood for Protection Paladin. So, damage buffs to Protection. 10% more Avenger shield damage, 15% more damage to Hammer of Wrath, and then 30% more damage to your generator, your spammy Blessed Hammer or Hammer of the Righteous. This will net out to be a 5 to 6% AoE damage increase. Prot Paladin wasn't as low, to be fair, in damage, as low as at least compared to Blood. They were already ahead of Blood. They weren't that weak in AoE damage already, so it's interesting to see Protection also buffed in their damage. Another tiny nudge, this is like the third nudge in a row for Holy Priest. They got a 5% all healing and then a 3% all healing and now another 3% all healing given to Holy Priest. Not really much else to say. Eventually, in about 3 months and increments of 3% healing buffs, Holy Priest will have enough throughput to match with Restoration Druids or Evokers. The other more interesting buff when it comes to healers is to Shaman. Because Shaman gets Healing Surge and Chain Heal buffed by 10%, Healing Wave buffed by 10%, and both of the parts of your Healing Rain and your talent, Overflowing Shores, are also buffed by 10%. You know, we are starting to reach, I have this feeling, this inkling that we are starting to reach critical mass when it comes to Restoration Shaman. They have now been buffed for 2 hotfixes in a row, and then they have been buffed in 10.0.5, they will be buffed in this hotfix, and then they will be buffed in 10.0.7. We have gotten to the point where Resto Shaman is already starting to be the strongest damage dealing healer out of all of them. As you can see from the current graphs in the raid, for example, Shamans are starting to realize, wait a second, I can actually pump a lot. And that's just for the raid. In Mythic Plus is the same. Mythic Plus in AoE damage, they can also do a lot of damage at the moment. What was missing was the throughput, which has kept getting buffed more and more. Cloudburst will be buffed significantly in the next patch. They have gotten buffs to Chain Heal, they have gotten also big buffs to Healing Rain, which are their 2 biggest abilities at the moment in terms of healing. So it's starting to be a very high level specs, I believe. I think that perhaps now is too late in Season 1, you know, 2 plus 3 months into the tier to suddenly change the meta out of nowhere, but I think by the end of Season 1 and perhaps getting into Season 2, the stocks of Resto Shaman will be much higher than they have been basically all this season. The last of the changes go to Warlocks, in particular Destro and Demo, but also some minor changes to the last talent, the last capstones of the general tree of Warlock, Inquisitor's Gaze and Summon Soulkeeper. These 2 depressing talents which can barely do 1% of your total damage now are getting buffed, both of them by 35%, mostly because, as I said, they do fuck all in terms of damage output, and even more so for being the last, the final points in your talent tree. You would like to see something cooler, you would like to see something bigger, you know, DKs get A-Bomb Limb, you know, mages get Shifting Power. Why am I getting something that does 1% of my damage as a Warlock? So Blizzard is trying to give those 2 talents a little bit more power. Talking about the specs in particular, Destruction gets a 20% damage buff to Soulfire, which means they don't get buffed at all, and then 5% damage to Incinerate, which also means they don't get buffed at all. Demo gets 30% damage to Vilefiend, which means they don't get buffed at all, and then a 15% damage to Wild Imp. Now, if you were getting excited, don't get mistaken, Wild Imp buff is this one. This one is the buff to Wild Imp, it's not this one. Implosion and Wild Imp are 2 different things, they have 2 different modifiers, they scale differently, so buffing Wild Imp is just buffing the base damage your Wild Imps are gonna be doing, not the damage of your Implosion, which is much more important. So even though Blizzard is recognizing that both Destro and Demo could use some improvements to their overall contribution in single target situations, I don't think these changes are that relevant for both of these specs at the moment. So with the Warlocks done, that was actually the last of the changes planned in a hotfix coming next reset. So missing from any of these changes, as we can see, is the entirety of Warrior, is the entirety of Mage, for once also is the entirety of Rogue. Perhaps somewhat interesting, especially seeing how they are buffing 2 different tanks in terms of damage. Maybe they could have also reined in a little bit more the damage of Protection Warrior, for example. I am also surprised, to close, about the lack of presence of Holy Paladin, because we have talked about healers getting changed, Now we have gotten quite a few hotfixes of buffs to Holy, buffs to Discipline, buffs to Mistweaver, nerfs to Resto Druid, and now nerfs to Evoker, and of course a gazillion buffs to Resto Shaman. So what has been missing basically are any meaningful and relevant changes to Holy Paladin in terms of healing balance. I thought that was interesting or curious or perhaps depressing if you're playing a Holy Paladin. But besides that, this is all we have for this Saturday when it comes to the hotfixes, which will go live in the next reset. So we're going to close this video, of course, as usual, by thanking all of my Patreon supporters. You can still support, of course, doing it for free, like liking and commenting down below, as well as subscribing to the channel itself. There are other ways to support for free, of course, like following me on Twitter. That would be helpful as well for you to get notified on whenever I have something to communicate and to share to all of my viewers, as well as, of course, the incoming, soon enough, I swear, return of my stream on Twitch. I will have a video about that quite soon, so stay tuned for that as well. Besides this, I'm going to leave you to the rest of your Saturday. Thanks, of course, as usual, for watching, guys. See you guys soon, and in the meantime, I don't feel too good. I woke up at 10 a.m. What do people do when they wake up at 10 a.m.? Oh.